Welcome to Regulatory Ramblings. Our podcast today is brought to you by the University of Hong Kong's RegTech Lab, the HKU SCF FinTech Academy, the Asia Global Institute, and the HKU edX Professional Certificate in FinTech, with support from the university's Faculty of Law. I'm your host, Ajay Shandasani. Today we're going to be looking at the wonderful world of virtual assets with a very special guest. Singapore-based Angela Ang is the Senior Policy Advisor at TRM Labs, a world-renowned blockchain intelligence company. As a former regulator, Angela spent over a decade at the Monetary Authority of Singapore, where she was most recently its Deputy Director in charge of licensing for payments and crypto service providers. Angela has been recognized as a LinkedIn top voice for finance in Asia for her thought leadership on digital asset developments in the Asia-Pacific region. And with that, I'll turn over to Angela. Angela, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, AJ. So glad to be here.
Our pleasure. So we like to kick things off by hearing a little bit from our guests about where they're from. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where'd you grow up? A little bit about your professional path.
Yeah, happy to, AJ. As you mentioned, I'm based in Singapore. I'm a born and bred Singaporean, very proud of that. I did spend a little bit of time growing up living in the US and in South Korea. Did business school at INSEAD, so really a big fan of trying to get an international perspective. And where I grew up professionally, as you mentioned, was actually really at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. I started my career at the MAS actually in business development, except that my product was Singapore. So for my first 5 years, I was kind of responsible for promoting Singapore as an international financial center. Took a break to go to business school, came back, did a stint in capital markets policy, as well as consumer education for Singaporeans, and finally, supervision and licensing of payments and crypto service providers, where I was part of the team that really pioneered the payments and crypto regulatory regime in Singapore back in 2020.
So in a real sense, you came of age, you matured at the MAS, and it was an important, I think, as we've discussed before, many MAS alumni sing its praises until much later on in life, that it shaped the trajectory of their careers, and they were proud to have served, because it's in the eyes of many, it's the best, if not one of the best, well-run financial regulators in Asia. Part of your professional development. What was it like being a regulator?
Absolutely. I think if you cut me open, I might still bleed blue and gold. Those are the MAS colors. Just kidding. Absolutely agree with all of that. And I think many of the MAS alumni exactly will resonate with those sentiments. And it's funny, it's actually a question that I get a lot. Like, what is it like being a regulator? What is it like working for the MAS? Well, the first thing is that I would say is, regulators are very much people too. I made a joke about if you cut me open, I'll bleed blue and gold. But really, to borrow a quote from the Merchant of Venice, if you cut us, do we not bleed? We're all, human beings. And I think from that perspective, MAS is really a great organization to work for, especially in your early career. I find as an organization, there is very high intellectual rigor, and people are super nice, mission-driven, really willing to share. And I think that really is what makes me and a lot of MAS alumni look back on our time at the MAS with gratitude and fondness. And I think from a professional perspective, we're also, as an MAS officer, you are very privileged to see policy making up close at the highest level. And I think there are very few jobs where you would have the chance to work with ministers and senior government leaders early on in your career. So I think from that perspective, it is, having a career at the MAS is really cool. And you kind of talked about being a leading regulator in the region. And I think part of this is, that it's ingrained in our DNA as an MAS officer from day one to always kind of consider both sides of the coin. throughout my policymaking journey at the MAS, I found that every policy move is looked at from both a risk and commercial standpoint. And overall, how does this affect Singapore as a financial hub? Because the fact is, a successful financial center, it needs to have growth and innovation, but it also needs to have a strong reputation and robust regulation, but not, suffocating growth at the same time. So it's a balancing act. And, everybody has different opinions on what is the right balance, but this is a conversation that we have almost daily at the MAS.
Tell us a little bit more about TRM Labs. I mean, a decade ago, people mainly spoke of your competitor, Chainalysis, but it seems like in a short time, you've taken pole position in the market, that more people are talking about TRM's successes. And this isn't to be, overly solicitous or rhapsodic, but you've carved a niche for yourselves in the market, and you're regarded as leaders in that, from having spoken to some of your customers and even some of the employees of your competitors. What is it the TRM does, and what is it the TRM does right to maintain its market position?
Thank you very much, AJ. I of course I couldn't agree more. And that's really part of the reason, or rather the main reason why, I joined TRM when the opportunity came up. I think everything about the company just really resonated with me. So let's level set kind of about this idea of blockchain intelligence or blockchain analytics, which is what does TRM Labs do, and what, do people in blockchain analytics do? And then I'll talk a little bit about, what I feel makes TRM so special. So blockchain analytics, I like to describe it as basically Google Maps for the blockchain. And some of you listening in might be familiar with this. But basically, it's the idea of helping our clients to make sense of public blockchain data and use that to fight fraud and financial crime. And this really comes back to the idea of public blockchains as a transparent and immutable ledger. What do I mean? Today, if you go on any block explorer like blockchain.com, you key in a blockchain wallet address, you will be able to pull up the transaction history. But everything kind of is like in a series of hashes. And that's not data that's easily understandable to the layman. And why I say it's like Google Maps for the blockchain is basically raw blockchain data, although it's public, it's like looking like at a satellite image with no context. So, maybe you can see trees, water, buildings, but, you don't really have information on what place you're looking at. But when you look at the same satellite image on Google Maps, you have location data, you can get directions, traffic information, etc., etc. And that is really what TRM does for blockchains. We help to make sense of the blockchain ledger by layering on information on real-world entities and people, like who owns this wallet, and what is the risk level of this entity or this wallet address. And we basically do this through a combination of different types of intelligence, both open source and proprietary. So that's kind of the fascinating world of blockchain analytics. And I think, that was something that really resonated with me, coming out of public service, coming out of a regulator, a compliance-centric business model, something that helps to fight fraud and financial crime. I think that was a business model that resonated with me, and I found the company as a whole to be very mission-driven. I think we do have a lot of people that join from the public sector and kind of understand the power of this data that we have in our hands to do good and to build a safer financial ecosystem. The other thing, and I think this is also part of what makes TRM so special, is that, there's really a spirit of nimbleness, a spirit of being pioneering, and kind of that's, you talked about 10 years ago. 10 years ago, TRM didn't exist, right? We were founded in 2018. And at that time, our founders already started to see that there was a shift where Bitcoin dominance was starting to come off. And it was very obvious that we were going to be in a world where you're talking about multiple blockchains, people moving across blockchains. And so from day one, TRM kind of pioneered our product in a way that was cross-chain native, where we kind of allow our users to visualize the flow of funds across different blockchains in a user-friendly and single interface. And I think this pioneering spirit just kind of continues in a very kind of fast iterating feedback loop. We have this term that we call TRM speed. And we just kind of wanna keep moving in a sensible way, to keep iterating, to keep listening to our customers, and pioneering new ways of doing things better and better. And so kind of like one of the newer things that we've looked at is this idea of behavioral intelligence in a blockchain ecosystem that is so vast, kind of be able to scale up your attribution and understanding of the raw blockchain data at scale, and in a sensible way. So one of the things that we came up with was signatures, where we basically leverage advanced machine learning to help our investigators to kind of detect somewhat overlooked suspicious patterns, and automatically detect the some complex behaviors across multiple transactions, looking at hidden relationships. And so it's kind of like this blend of technology and human expertise. And that's just kind of reflective of the company, that we're always moving ahead, we're always pioneering. And I think at the core of it is really the people, it's the culture, and that's what makes TRM truly special to me.
Okay, so in your current role, would it be fair to say it's equal parts regulatory affairs, regulatory relations, regulatory policy, and business development?
I think my main role is still very much, public policy and government affairs. And what is that is, yes, kind of like building our relationships with regulators, with governments, as a thought leader. And of course, we do have a lot of clients in the public sector as well. So there obviously is an element of customer relationship management, but I think primarily our role is kind of, to be an expert, a resource to our clients on policy and regulatory methods in the crypto ecosystem.
I'm constantly reminded of how crypto is not something that's new, that the paper from Satoshi Nakamoto came out in 2009, in Hong Kong, our AMLO, our anti-money laundering ordinance, envisaged cryptocurrencies. It wrote it into the statute, into the act, into the ordinance in 2012. Bottom line, it's crypto virtual assets. They're not that young anymore. Yet everyone came to the realization that they were going to matter at different points. I guess for you, what was the, shall we say, aha moment? What was the moment of epiphany when you realized digital assets are going to matter even more in the future, and this is something I need to pay attention to and learn about? When did that moment come for you?
Yeah, interesting question. But before I answer it, I just want to double click on your point that people say crypto is not that young anymore. And 2008. So if you think of that in the a human being that's born in 2008 wouldn't even be 20 years old. It's basically an adolescent, right? And how old is the financial sector? It's literally, like more than a century of modern financial services as we know it. And when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, crypto is still really, really young. And I think we have to kind of look at it with that lens.
Because people see the valuations and they're like, I'm sorry, the established interests have carved it up. They've marked up the value. I'm an ordinary guy. I can't get in. A lot of people are looking at it from that point of view. Different views, but some people say it's up and coming. Others say it's already come. And so there's that degree of trepidation, to say nothing of the fact that, I'm sorry, a lot of Asians are just not sold on it. That's my sense of the preventing you of your cross. It's changing slowly.
Yeah.
People are seeing the gains that are to be had if you're looking at it from a speculator or investor standpoint. And then you've got the techies who see the uses of the underlying technology.
I think what you're talking about is adoption, which I kind of see as the first step to maturity, right? It's kind of like a child learning how to walk and run and talk and spell. But what kind of really marks that transition into adulthood is that sense of maturity, responsibility. And I think in an industry and corporate context, that's really about, regulatory maturity, maturity of risk management and governance. And that is very much a journey that we're still going through. In fact, as you kind of alluded to, we're still going through this adoption journey. So I think we're very, very early in the journey in the grand scheme of things. I know it feels like a lot of time has passed since that Bitcoin white paper, but we are still very early in that journey. And, coming back to my kind of aha moment, it actually happened, it happened over a series of events. And my first exposure to the world of crypto and blockchain was actually in 2015 when I was part of the capital markets policy team. And that was when we started to see, kind of early applications of blockchain in the space, starting to kind of move beyond cryptocurrencies. And so my boss at the time basically said, like, can you kind of find out a little bit more about what exactly this blockchain is about? Kind of do like a little research project. And I just dived in and kind of just learned whatever I could about distributed ledger technology, about blockchain. And I just found this concept of permissionlessness particularly fascinating. That was in 2015. And then a year later, I went away and I did a stint running financial education programs for the Singapore public, where the government, and even up till today, was cautioning retail investors against investing in crypto because it is volatile and risky. So my introduction to the world of blockchain and cryptocurrencies was kind of like an interesting contrast between the promise of blockchain technology and the risk of investing in crypto, which, to be honest, it very much reflects the Singapore government's stance today, as kind of enshrined in Ravi Menon, a former MAS managing director's speech, which he titled basically "Yes to Digital Asset Innovation and No to Cryptocurrency Speculation." So that was kind of like the introduction. But when I really started to get a view of, adoption and crypto kind of being here to stay was in my next stint, actually, and my last stint before I left the MAS, where I was basically leading licensing for MAS's brand new payments and crypto regulatory regime. So I actually joined that team in 2019, and that was right before the rollout of the regime in January 2020. When the regime came live, we realized that, wow, there were about 170 crypto players that were already operating in Singapore at the time, and they had expressed their interest to apply for license. So the number that actually got the license is much smaller, but that's another story. So, when you start to see numbers like that, when you start to kind of understand the size of the ecosystem and kind of how sticky it is to Singapore, and you start to see that also in an international context, which I'm still doing today at TRM Labs, that's when I'm kind of like, crypto is really here to stay. I think it's still going through a maturity journey, but it is something that I think is going to be around for the foreseeable future.
How would you describe the current state of crypto regulation in Singapore and Asia more generally? How are things going well, or is expected, or are there any sources of concern?
Yeah, I think generally we are in a very good place in Asia, because Asia is really, and there have been a lot of articles written about this, but Asia is really leading the pack in terms of regulatory clarity. We've seen a lot of movement in terms of, developing kind of crypto regulation across the region, and especially so in the Asian financial hubs of Singapore and Hong Kong. And Singapore was, actually the first country to kind of pioneer bespoke crypto regulation was Japan, which is also, an Asian regulator. That was in 2017 because, they kind of experienced very early on the impact that failures in the crypto ecosystem could have on the investing public and so on. Singapore was kind of the next big one in Asia, where they kind of rolled out the crypto licensing regulatory regime in 2020, and there were a couple of others, like Malaysia rolled out its regime in 2019. So there was kind of a lot of thought leadership around like, hey, this is an industry that we need to regulate and we need to think about it maybe a little bit differently. And we've really kind of seen, especially in the last 2 years, regulators really accelerate the regulatory clarity in Asia that they're bringing to the industry. Just in the last kind of year, alone, we've seen massive movement in Singapore and Hong Kong. Singapore has introduced, rules around custody of customer assets. It's introduced its licensing regime for custody service providers. It's going to expand the licensing requirements for service providers incorporated in Singapore. In Hong Kong, they're looking at regulating over-the-counter activity. The virtual asset trading platform licensing regime that came live this year. Last year and the grace period has kind of just ended. And right now they're going to enter into a phase where they're going to inspect some of these applicants, kind of understand the level of practical rigor. And also there's been a lot of enforcement action in Hong Kong. They've been clamping down on fraud, scams, and unlicensed activity. So I think there's a lot of activity, and it's meaningful activity. And more importantly, I think it is activity that is taking place in close engagement with the industry. And I think this is very distinctive, especially in markets like Singapore and Hong Kong, in terms of how actively regulators and policymakers engage the industry. I think this kind of shows that there is a commitment to getting it right. And when I say getting it right, when it comes to regulation, it doesn't mean making it easy, but making sure that it's done properly, it's done well, and in a way that makes sense, that is implementable. Because I think regulators here understand that their rules are only as good and only as effective as the implementation. So there's a commitment to really understanding the space and kind of talking with players and saying like, hey, how would you actually implement this requirement? And being very open to hear kind of some of the practical challenges there as well.
I suppose a corollary to that is, what do you see as the challenge for enforcement then, given different places are advancing new laws and regulations in crypto and digital assets at different rates? Yes, Asia in general is in good stead, but this has always been the case. Markets are at different levels of sophistication and development. That applies to their financial systems and their economies and also their regulatory regimes.
Yes, fair enough. I think, we are always, and this is true not just of crypto, but, of life in general and the world in general, we're always moving at different paces. And, every regulator is also going to have a slightly different philosophy in terms of how they look at crypto, right? So I think that's par for the course, but I think we are generally moving in the direction of more robust regulation, more kind of consumer protection. And there was the TRM policy team actually kind of did a deep dive into 21 jurisdictions, looking at 70% of global crypto exposure. Last year, we found that 80% of these jurisdictions, they had actually moved to tighten crypto regulation, and almost half of them specifically progress some sort of consumer protection measure. So there is kind of like there's a momentum that's moving in the direction. And you talked about enforcement. When I look at regulation and enforcement, I think they're really two sides of the same coin. They are mutually reinforcing loops that go hand in hand, because regulation is really about setting up controls and requirements to prevent illicit activity, to prevent bad stuff from happening. Enforcement is about, if bad stuff happens, disrupting that and making sure that there are consequences. So in my view, I think regulation provides more levers for enforcement actually against recalcitrant entities. And more robust regulation is a good thing from an enforcement perspective. But I think, if we want to talk about, the practical aspect of enforcement, like especially enforceable regulation, I think there are kind of two dimensions here. One is understanding. Authorities really need to have a deep understanding of implementation, and that's why that kind of engagement and conversation that's happening in places like Singapore and Hong Kong is so important. They need to understand the tech, understand implementation, to know whether the controls that their regulated entities have put in place are effectively, complying with the requirements that they've set in place, effective in achieving the regulatory outcomes that they had in mind. And then, of course, the second one is a little bit more banal. It's resourcing, just having this idea of having enough skilled people to conduct ongoing, rigorous supervision. And here, of course, there's a certain element of risk-based supervision. And again, that's kind of like the skills to have a good rubric for measuring risk in order to prioritize which entities you maybe want to supervise a little bit more closely.
Let's pick up on your point about resourcing, because I think we know some of the same people. We're part of the same WhatsApp groups and mailing lists. I mean, and I'm constantly getting messages, through formal and informal channels from recruiters that there's a shortage for talent in terms of the people who are able to do the required tech analyses, and this comes through on WhatsApp as well. One posting I'm looking at from last night, and these shortages are in Hong Kong and Singapore, and Dubai primarily. Is there a shortage of talented people in this space, or are they just shifting them over from the worlds of conventional finance and saying, okay, apply your craft, apply your skills to this new domain? And if there's some degree of remedial education to equip yourself for this new world of finance, but your prior skills are still relevant. And my sense is that that's what they're doing, because there aren't that many crypto compliance people per se, to pure crypto compliance people per se, to be had. Is there a shortage, or is it relative to what they're willing to pay? There's a shortage, and if they increase remuneration levels, more people would join more people would enter the market, more people would join the fray.
Yeah, I think, AJ, when it comes to compliance talent, the shortage is a general one across the financial sector, and we're feeling it more acutely in crypto as a function really of how fast the industry is growing and how new it is. And I guess from a technological perspective, how it's different from, traditional finance. And it's something that's been widely spoken on, reported on, and it's really true across both the public and private sector. You mentioned some of the...
But do the skills differ that much?
So I think, to your question, I think the kind of principles around compliance and risk management are broadly applicable, but the devil's always in the details, right? And this is true for setting regulatory requirements as well. Nobody is going to disagree that you need good corporate governance, you need transparent disclosures, and this is true of both traditional finance and crypto. And so when I talk about this, what should we learn from TradFi question, I think my answer is always, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are things that we can learn, and there's no need to reinvent the wheel, and there is quite a little bit of overlap there. But the kind of technology that blockchain and cryptocurrency is built on, it does kind of create differences. For example, right, if you want to look at KYC and customer due diligence, verifying the ownership of a bank account is very different from verifying the ownership of a blockchain wallet address. There are different processes around it. And you kind of have to understand how cryptocurrency, how blockchain works in order to think about controls and processes that make sense in that context. So I think the answer is yes and no. And there is a little bit of a learning curve coming in as a compliance person to the crypto space, and having to kind of learn about that. And actually, I just want to give a shout out to this program that we have in Singapore, that's actually started by Elevandi. Elevandi is a non-profit that's set up by the MAS, and basically they identified a talent gap at the intersection of compliance, data, and digital assets. And so they kind of approached us to say, hey, I think we need to kind of develop talent from the ground up, go back to the schools, and kind of, introduce the idea of a career in crypto compliance and investigations. And so we partnered Elevandi along with Amazon and Crypto.com to create a talent development program for crypto compliance and investigations that's targeted at students in local universities and polytechnics. And so I think they're kind of very interesting things that are going on, and I think that's incredibly meaningful. There's a whole journey that we need to go on, and there's always more that can be done.
Everyone's by this point heard of fintech and its outgrowth, regtech and insurtech and wealth tech, and now people are talking about SupTech or supervisory technology. How can or are SupTech tools being developed for non-blockchain and crypto professionals? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So, when you talk about SupTech and RegTech, basically what TRM has built, it is both SupTech and RegTech, right? Because we have compliance teams at crypto companies and financial institutions that use our tool, as part of, their AML, their suite of, AML controls for customer onboarding, ongoing due diligence, transaction monitoring, to basically help them keep illicit actors off their platform. And then we also have regulators that use our tool as RegTech, to get real-time information on entities' activities on the blockchain and kind of make sure that it measures up with what they're being told by the regulated entities or entities that are seeking to be regulated. And so to double click on that SupTech point, I think that as regulators are building up their knowledge of blockchain and crypto, they start to see greater possibilities for the use of blockchain analytics, for example, in SupTech. It really is a powerful SupTech tool. And regulators are starting to catch on to this. We have seen regulators start to collect blockchain addresses from their regulators, from entities that are seeking to be licensed for analysis, because they understand that the immutable truth that's available on public blockchain ledgers, layered with attribution to real-world persons, that can be very powerful in triangulating, what they're seeing in their engagements, direct engagements with these entities. And also it opens up the possibility of real-time monitoring, getting more frequent, more updated information without having to add reporting burden on the regulated entities. And then to your second question on, developing SupTech tools kind of for, non-crypto experts in the space, I think you cannot escape from needing to have a foundational understanding of how crypto and blockchain operates in order to leverage SupTech, right? For example, you need to know about blockchain wallet addresses, you need to understand the concept of transaction hashes, public ledgers, and how they work. In order to know that, by analyzing this information, you can gain valuable insight. But you shouldn't need to be a master investigator or an deep expert in blockchain technology to be able to do some level of due diligence and analysis. So I think the goal of SupTech providers should be to make their tools accessible to non-experts. And I can speak for TRM, we've always focused on making our tool user-friendly. And frankly, there are many things, even from day one, which I was able to intuitively understand. And, I'm not a cryptographer. I'm not a, expert blockchain tracer, but just by going to the tool and looking at the information on there, I was able to understand how this could be valuable. One example is a functionality that we have on our platform called Know Your Entity, where basically you can look up an entity in TRM and you get a page that's kind of like a Google reviews page, right? Where we present a risk score for the entity, risk indicators that's based on their on-chain footprint, and also things like off-chain information, like, what are the AML and KYC standards? And here I use the Google reviews analogy because I found the information really as easy to understand as reading a Google review. So it is helping, users to make sense of on-chain data in a way that doesn't require them to be like a technical expert.
Well, that is a great step forward. So all too often when we talk about crypto, the concerns about financial crime, getting around sanctions, money laundering, terrorist financing arise. And there is something to be said for that, though sometimes it's overblown. But when it comes to crypto crimes, given all the research that TRM Labs does, and you put out a lot of useful literature, a lot of useful thought leadership pieces, but based on TRM's own estimates, what percentage would you say of crypto crimes is linked with Asia, and how does that compare to non-crypto-based money laundering?
Well, first, let's look at the global picture. And over here, our recent analysis found that last year, in terms of illicit volumes within the crypto ecosystem, it was about 34.8 billion US dollars. That is a very large amount, and we shouldn't trivialize it. But that is basically 0.63% of the entire, the entire set of volumes that's going through the ecosystem. And I think that is pretty comparable to what we're seeing in traditional finance. So there's 0.63% of illicit activity. Then the other 99%, there's a lot of building and innovation going on. And that's kind of how we always try to balance the conversation when we talk about crypto-enabled crime. Now, coming to Asia, I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that the very nature of crypto is that it is borderless, and there are many, illicit actors, syndicates that operate transnationally. But anecdotally, we know that there are many pig butchering schemes, that really often collect and launder their scam proceeds in crypto that operate out of Asia. We know that North Korean state-backed actors are behind some of the most prolific crypto hacks. And, we are really seeing a very wide variety of crypto-enabled crime across the region. And this is really true of the world. Earlier this year, I actually wrote a series on the must-know crypto investigations. And I had, one on the Americas, on Europe, and on Asia. And so, there's really like a wide plethora of activity happening, not just in Asia, but, across the world. And this is definitely something that we need to keep an eye on.
Now, of course, the issue of crypto crimes has serious implications for virtual asset services providers, or VASPs or VASPs. How do you see VASPs responses to crypto crimes evolving in the past couple of years? I mean, clearly they're taking the matter more seriously. Would you say, are they better equipped to handle the issue now?
Yeah, I think it's always evolving, but I do think there's been a lot of growth, both in awareness and in expertise. Both go hand in hand, really. And I think it kind of goes back to like 2 years ago where, we had Terra and FTX, the whole series of events. What really happened there was that it created an awareness in the broader industry of the importance of trust, of the importance of credibility. And many kind of came out of that cognizant that series of events created a huge loss of trust, and we do have to work to build it back. So, we talked earlier about, this idea of a maturity journey, and I really see this as an adolescence, a journey of growing pains as we step into greater maturity as an industry, not just from an adoption perspective, but also from a governance perspective. And what we have seen is that as the industry has matured, it has acknowledged its role in crime fighting in an increasingly bigger way. And VAS, they know that it's good for business to do this because, number one, it means that you don't get targeted by the authorities. And secondly, it means that you have a stronger reputation with your stakeholders. So we do see VAS kind of dedicating more resources to detecting crime in their ecosystem. And many of them have taken a collaborative approach to working with law enforcement as well. And at TRM, we have the privilege of working with both the public and the private sector, and we work very collaboratively with our clients on both sides. And I'd just like to highlight one example of that led to an arrest actually of a high-ranking ISIS recruiter and fundraiser. Basically, what happened here was that our threat intel team at TRM, we identified an on-chain address that was controlled by this individual that really had received actually about $2 million US in Tether on Tron. And the donations had come from both centralized exchanges as well as, self-custodial wallets. And what happened was that when we identified this campaign, our intel analysts basically traced the funds on blockchain and basically found that there was, the group was actually using Binance to cash out some of their funds. So we notified Binance, and aided by Binance's own KYC controls, their compliance and financial crime team was able to find out the person that was operating the account and then alert the local authorities, who then went on to disrupt the activities and finally, led to arrests of two individuals in Tajikistan and then subsequently the rest of the senior ISIS fundraiser that was allegedly behind that entire $1 million fundraising campaign in Turkey.
You're an industry insider, and so no doubt you're constantly talking to people. what do you see in the market is in terms of the percentage of VASPs that deploy risk controls and mandate market misconduct governance? What would you put that figure at if a figure can be arrived at just based on all the research that TRM has done?
Yeah, so I don't have a number, but as you said, what I do have is my finger on the pulse, and what I can say is that it is definitely growing. It is definitely kind of grow, and really, when we talk about risk controls, that has become par for the course in jurisdictions where crypto regulation exists today, and that's really an increasingly large set. As I mentioned, we kind of looked at 21 key jurisdictions last year, and 80% of them had done some sort of tightening of crypto regulation. And what we found in the same report was that VASPs in countries that had full licensing and supervision regimes, they had much lower rates of illicit activities than those in less regulated jurisdictions. And why? I think a big part of that is the, mandating of these risk controls. But again, there are different degrees of risk controls. I think there are very few exchanges today that have no controls. And frankly, those are what we would consider high-risk exchanges that, basically exist maybe, in sanctioned jurisdictions, for example, that exists as a conduit for bad actors to basically, move outside, outside the regulatory parameter. But other than that, I think, most exchanges have in place a degree of risk controls, and that is actually leveling up alongside, the leveling up of crypto regulation around the world. Now, you mentioned market misconduct, and I think there it's more of an emerging area from a regulatory perspective as well, and it's a very serious one that we need to address as an industry. And the IOSCO FinTech Task Force has put it as a priority item on their crypto asset roadmap. We've seen places like Singapore, begin to work to extend measures that currently apply in traditional markets to crypto. On things like insider trading, market manipulation, because basically insider trading is insider trading, whether it's, traditional markets or crypto markets.
Let's turn our attention for a moment to the Financial Action Task Force. For our listeners, it's the Paris-based body that sets global norms and standards for anti-money laundering, KYC, and countering terrorist financing. So, with regard to the FATF travel rule, how effective has implementation of that been?
So, on the travel rule, just this year, FATF actually released a stocktake of materially important jurisdictions in the realm of virtual assets. And that stocktake found that 84% of these jurisdictions had enacted or were in the process of enacting the travel rule. And that's a pretty high number, but of course, that's just the first step. When it comes to effectiveness, the devil is in the detail is, kind of what's the level of compliance and what's the efficacy of this compliance. And here, shout out to our friends at Nota Bene, who have a great state of travel rule report, which if you want to find out about travel rules, is a great read. And they have some pretty good numbers. And their latest report, which was in March this year, they found that 96% of VASPs are already travel rule compliant, or they plan to be travel rule compliant. But, again, going back to my point that the devil's in the details, there is this issue of in the travel rule space, we call it the sunrise issue, where right now the travel rule is being rolled out at different paces across different jurisdictions. And so you may be in a jurisdiction where you're required to be fully compliant right now, and you have the data and system set up, but a VASP in another country that your customers are dealing with or that you are dealing with, may not have the travel rule enforced yet, and they may not have the data and systems to comply. And what the Nota Bene State of Travel Rule report found was that kind of 2/3 of their respondents highlighted this issue of basically a multi-jurisdictional rollout as a critical success factor for their travel rule solutions. And right now we're kind of in this period where we still have a sunrise issue. And they also found that it is a significant one because in terms of sending and receiving recipient and sender data, 37% of their survey respondents actually said that they did not receive any travel rule information for a substantial number of transactions. So this issue is very real. But at the same time, they also found that there is a shift towards stricter compliance enforcement, and the percentage of VASPs that do not allow withdrawals unless a travel rule message can be transmitted to the beneficiary VASP has tripled from 8% to 23%. So of course, this is, there's still a long way to go. But I think, it is a journey that we need to go on. Because of the global nature of crypto and how just borderless this ecosystem is, it is something that is really quite challenging to implement.
There was a lot of, I don't know if controversy is the right word, but a lot of hubbub, a lot of discussion, a lot of expressions of aggravation at the travel rule when it was first announced. But it was an important rule to have, and I guess you pointed out people are adjusting to it at their own rates. I'm also thinking about, not regard to the travel rule, but more broadly, China, North Korea, Russia. I mean, the more you look at it, the more you see crypto does relate to some of the bigger issues going on in the world right now. And the concern is that countries like China, North Korea, Russia are using crypto to get around sanctions, one, and two, using it to pay their operatives abroad, thereby bypassing, the SWIFT system and the international banking system, which let's be honest, it's a heavily U.S. dominated architecture, and if the Americans decide to cut you out of the American banking system, you're effectively cut out of the global banking system. So, what are your thoughts then on China, North Korea, and Russia using crypto to get around sanctions and to pay their operatives overseas? Are should we be concerned, or are the safeguards there?
Yeah, thanks, AJ. I think, you've kind of highlighted some of the key issues there, and maybe where I can add on to the discussion is just to contribute a couple of factoids about what we're seeing in the space. And, earlier, North Korea, right? Earlier I mentioned they are, one of the most prolific hackers within the crypto ecosystem. And last year, we found that hackers tied to North Korea stole at least 600 million in cryptocurrency, with their hacks being on average 10 times as damaging as those that were not linked to North Korea. And if we widen the time period, looking back to 2017, nearly $3 billion worth of crypto has been linked to North Korean state-backed actors. So I think it is quite significant, and they are very sophisticated in terms of how they perpetrate these hacks and then how they actually obfuscate the flow of funds. In the early exploits, that tended to involve the direct use of cryptocurrency exchanges, and now their kind of typologies feature highly complex multi-stage money laundering processes. And this is really in response to kind of more aggressive sanctions, law enforcement focus, and also improved tracing capabilities. So is this something that we should be worried about? Yes, but it's not some. I mean, it is something that we're getting increasingly clever at doing. But as we get clever, the threat actors also get cleverer. So it's a constant journey of both kind of keeping at the cutting edge. And you talked about China and Russia. Just a couple of data points that I can share here. We have seen some activity by Chinese-based threat actors who move their money through crypto. I think, for example, there's been a lot of dialogue around, fentanyl manufacturing and, manufacturing of drug precursors. And earlier this year, TRM studied over 120 Chinese manufacturers of fentanyl and other drug precursors, and basically found that 97% of these manufacturers offered payment in cryptocurrencies, and then they received over 26 million US dollars in cryptocurrency last year. And between 2022 and last year, the amount of cryptocurrency deposited in their wallets actually increased over 600%. And in just the first quarter of this year alone, it's already more than doubled. So it is kind of like a significant problem. And even beyond the drug trade, we've seen crypto being used in China for illegal money movement. And Chinese law enforcement themselves actually cracked down on a crypto-based kind of underground bank that was facilitating over 2 billion renminbi in illegal currency conversions, taking advantage of basically, virtual currencies to illegally carry out exchange business between the renminbi and the Korean won. Kind of leveraging over-the-counter virtual currency trading. And China right now is undergoing their first review of AML law since 2007. And one of the things that the government there has done is to call on financial institutions to pay attention to risks that are stemming from the use of emerging technologies and products such as virtual currencies. So I think it is definitely an issue there that is being recognized both within China and also kind of on a global scale. And, Russia, again, there is a fair bit of data around Russian-speaking threat actors playing outsized role in crypto-enabled crime. For example, in ransomware, what we found kind of just actually last month, we released a report on this, is that Russian-speaking ransomware groups, they accounted for at least 69% of all crypto proceeds from ransomware in 2023. And this, in an absolute number terms, exceeds US 500 million. And, similar pattern in darknet markets. Russian-speaking darknet markets comprise 95% of all crypto-denominated illicit drug sales. And then when we talk about sanctions, we found that actually inflows to just one Russia-based crypto exchange, Garantex, which I think has been widely written about, that accounted for 80% of crypto volumes belonging to all sanctioned entities internationally. So I think, this is happening at scale in some of these jurisdictions. In these jurisdictions that you mentioned, it is something that we are paying attention to, that law enforcement is paying attention to, that authorities are paying attention to, and it is a huge concern. It continues to be a huge concern. But it's also something that we're always getting smarter and addressing, because when something is a huge concern, that's when you kind of put a huge amount of time and resources towards understanding it and combating it and disrupting it.
TRM serves a great number of clients. You provided services for law enforcement and national governments in the past. Can you describe that business at all? I mean, how have you helped them? How have you enhanced their capabilities? And any success stories, any war stories you can share?
Yeah, I think we've done a lot of work with law enforcement around the world, with the US Secret Service, with the FBI, and with the National Crime Agency in the UK, and many, many more. Basically, what happens here is they use tools like TRM to follow the money on public blockchain ledger, to identify the bad guys and seize funds. So war stories, there's this one that I quite like, where basically the US Secret Service, they use TRM in an investigation on a pig butchering scam. And, these are getting more and more commonplace. They're very, very damaging. And, the term is actually a Chinese one, which basically talks about going the whole hog. It's a long con. Scammers really gain the trust of their victims and then just take them for everything that they're worth. So there's always a lot of money at stake here. And, life savings, people's dignity, and so on. And in this case, what happened was the scammer actually lured victims. Quite a typical typology, actually. The scammer lured their victims into investing into a fraudulent crypto platform. And in total, about 5.5 million US dollars was sent by 7 victims to this scam trading platform. And what happened was, usually when you realize you've been scammed is, your investment gains are going up and up and up, also with themes on the platform, and then you want to withdraw your gains and you realize that you can't. And that's when you realize it's a scam. And this victim reached out to the US Secret Service for help. So using information that was provided by the victim, the USS investigators were able to plot the flow of funds in TRM from the original investment platform address through dozens of addresses and multiple types of cryptocurrencies. The victim actually paid in the USDC stablecoin, which was then swapped to DAI, and then to USD Tether, and then also moved through several Ethereum blockchain addresses. Eventually, investigators, it kind of came to a self-hosted wallet, and the funds were just sitting there. And when we talk about a self-hosted wallet, it's difficult to kind of carry out a seizure because there is no service provider that you can deal with. But then, it also means that the scammers can't cash out their funds. So what they do is that it's quite common for scammers to kind of park their funds in an unhosted wallet for days, weeks, or even months, and hoping that the authorities will just kind of let things slide, and eventually they will find a service provider to off-ramp. But what these investigators did was that they basically set up alerts in TRM on all these wallet addresses to notify them each time there was a fund movement. And this is very critical because what they're waiting for is that specific moment when the scammers transfer the funds out of that self-hosted wallet to cash out at a service provider at an exchange. And that is a prime opportunity for law enforcement intervention to go to that exchange and enact an asset seizure. But it must be done very quickly before the funds are allowed to pass through the exchange successfully and out of reach of the authorities. So in this case, what happened was when the funds finally moved from the scammer's self-hosted wallet address to an exchange, the Secret Service received an alert. And basically, with the data that they had gathered from their on-chain analysis in TRM and other evidence, they were able to secure a seizure warrant within hours. And this is very critical because time is of the essence here. And then out of the 5.5 million that was, lost by 7 victims, they were actually able to seize about $5 million in stolen funds. So I think that's a great story. And, personally for me, as someone working in TRM, when I hear these stories, it really kind of gives a very tangible, tangible color to our mission of, building a safer financial system for billions of people.
I agree that is quite an achievement, quite definitely one of the successes worth singing about. When crypto first started out, it was just Bitcoin, and then there was Ethereum and Litecoin and altcoin, and so now there is so many, and I'm just wondering, does the proliferation of different types of digital currency, does it make the use of digital currency as a vehicle for financial crime inevitable?
I think it is. I think, my kind of thing is that where there's value, there's crime, right? If an asset has no value, then why would people want to put their illicit proceeds in that asset class? And this is true of the banking ecosystem, of cash, real estate, precious metals, wine, luxury handbags, whatever you can think of that can be a store of value. And, why crypto assets have become more attractive to illicit actors is kind of like the same reason that it's become more attractive to licit actors, which is basically adoption, liquidity, and just the growth of the ecosystem, making it easier to, monetize and liquidate your gains, to buy it, all the things that you want with your illicit proceeds. You can, there are like a variety of service providers where you can off-ramp it into cash and buy your Ferrari and live the high life and things like that. So I think it is really the adoption that is driving, in the interest from illicit actors. And that is the same in any asset class. It is not a story that is unique to crypto.
Well, I agree. And certainly in the early days, you saw a great deal, you saw penchant on the part of the mainstream press to malign, to disparage crypto every chance you got. that if you took crypto out of the story and replaced it with fine art, wine, US dollars as the instrument involved, the story would still read the same.
Exactly. And, when you look at a lot of, money laundering, like national risk assessments, a lot of, governments still acknowledge that the biggest kind of conduit for financial crime is still the banking ecosystem, just because of how sizable it is, right? I mean, like I said, where there's value, there's crime. Like, are banks bad? No, it is, they are providing an important utility to all of us. And that's what makes them attractive to illicit actors. And that's the same in crypto.
And it's certainly something to watch out for. I know that a lot of criminals try to exploit the asymmetries within a given financial institution. They see there are weak spots in certain organs, certain branches, certain divisions of that institution, and that's where they try to get in. But as we bring things to a close, any advice to young graduates or people seeking a career in this space? Any words of wisdom you care to impart?
I think if you're seeking a career in crypto, and this is a little bit biased, consider a career in crypto regulation and compliance. I think, if you want to find meaning in your work, you want to, you're a mission-driven person, there's no place that you will find that more than in this space of compliance and regulation, because it is really about, upholding the integrity of the ecosystem. And even if you don't, I think it's still important to kind of have an understanding of the important role of compliance and risk management in the long-term sustainability of crypto businesses. So, if you're in Singapore, check out the Elevandi Blockchain Guardians program. Well, we have closed applications for this year, but there's always next year. Talk to people, find out more, and I think find what makes you come alive. I think that is the most important.
On a related note, what if someone wants to get into a career in regulatory policy? How should they approach it, and what are the skills and credentials they need?
I think go for it. Especially if you're coming out of school, the only kind of credential you really need is a desire to do the right thing, and a desire to learn and kind of apply that intellectual rigor to your work. I think at the end of the day, what really makes you successful in this space and in any career is a passion for what you're doing. And here it is really about doing the right thing and upholding the integrity of the financial system.
Increasingly we're seeing more of these roles under the banner of regulatory affairs, regulatory relations, intergovernmental affairs, government relations. Why is that? Why has the demand for such professionals increased?
Well, I can only give you an anecdote. And this was me kind of in the early days of joining TRM. We were working through an industry consultation with, a working group comprised of stakeholders across the industry. And someone in the room was like, "Oh, it's super useful to have Angela in the room because she speaks Regulator. You might as well say she speaks Greek." But I guess.
But yeah, you represented the regulatory sector.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess the industry has found that as it's growing up, it's maturing, it's becoming a big boy, it has to comply, and it's kind of important to have people that have an understanding and empathy of how to engage meaningfully with the authorities.
Certainly something for those to consider if that's the route they choose to go down. We've covered an immense amount of ground in this chat. Is there anything you want to say lastly? Anything you feel we didn't cover?
No, I think as you said, we've covered a wide depth and breadth of issues. And the only thing I would say is that it takes all of us to build a safer crypto economy. So let's keep going and let's keep building.
Angela, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, AJ. It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you. Until next time.